Hello friends, welcome to another day of Q&As, joined by my lovely and helpful wife Lucie.
Hi guys.
Lucie will be asking me one of your questions from Instagram.
Hi. Next question is by Core Laboratories. I remember you mentioned psychopath ASPD in the Jerry Brainham interview. What could be different about their hormones and neurotransmitter levels? Could this also have a secondary effect on the formation of different regions inside their brains?
Thank you, Lucie. Okay, thank you for your question. I didn't actually mention psychopaths in the Jerry Brainham interview. Jerry Brainham mentioned psychopaths. Let me just tell you what my opinion on this subject is. I do not believe this. I believe this term psychopath is used by, first of all, just so you guys know, psychopath is a term that was invented or started by a guy named Koch, a German psychologist in 1888, 130 years ago or so. It means a suffering soul. Before Koch, there were several psychiatrists or psychologists, whatever they were at the time, in the 100 years beforehand, who had remarked on people that had what was called moral insanity, where they were lucid, but their morality didn't make sense. They did odd things. And since Koch invented the term, in about the 1920s, 1930s, it became very popular. At that time, of course, psychology was not very scientific. It was, even people like Freud, very scientific, odd kind of analyses. Of course, I'm more of a Jungian, I like Jungian psychology, but in either case, it was not a science at all. It was, I don't know what to call it. It's not a social science for sure. If you look at economics, we use mathematics in economics. Anyway, the point is, now psychology is turning into neuroscience, and the bridge between neuroscience, which is a new field, and psychology. Originally, psychology started becoming more serious with a field called cognitive psychology. So social psychology was always a bit wishy-washy, and other kinds of psychology were, but cognitive psychology, which was actually developed at Carnegie Mellon, was really trying to focus on how the brain works. But neuroscience, another level of detail, is what I'm interested in personally. The gap from neuroscience to psychology will eventually be bridged. Now, while it's being bridged, there will be a lot of concepts in psychology which will be thrown out the window. One of them that will be thrown out is this concept called psychopath. So in 1980, there's a researcher from University of British Columbia named Hare, H-A-R-E, if you want to read more about him, who developed a checklist for psychopaths. And this is not a joke. This checklist is what they use to decide if somebody's a psychopath. So
I've seen it before.
Oh yeah? So the Hares Checklist was created in 1980. It was updated one more time in 2003 because in the interim, him and his team of people, including a gentleman named K-I-E-H-L, Kyle, I don't know how he says his name. He's an author of one of the 3 books on psychopaths that I own in this library behind me, although they're not visible. People like him and other researchers went into prisons and they interviewed people on camera for a couple of hours, asked them a lot of questions, and after they interview them, they take the checklist and they decide, according to the checklist, what qualities they have and to what magnitude. And then they add up the numbers, and anything above a certain number, it's above 30 I think in the original checklist, they classify him as a psychopath. So, and then what they do is, after that researcher did that, another researcher will be shown the video to also watch the video and then decide and independently rate it. And if both of them rate it above 30, they decide he is this concept called psychopath. Now, what makes people think there is a thing called a psychopath? You can decide to call something, right? And you can define it yourself. But does that thing really exist in the world? Or is it something you're defining? So for example, a messy person. Is there a thing called a messy person? Are people born messy? Is the messiness an attribute that is within something that you cannot take out of it? Is it an attribute that you cannot break down into other attributes? Or is it a combination of different things that is fluid, that is qualitatively and subjectively decided? So this is where it comes into wishy-washy kind of things. The idea of a psychopath, I mean, look, one of the things on the checklist is how many times has the person been married? If you've been married 3 or 4 times, short marriages, whoa, you got one of the serious parts of it. That's a serious part.
Is empathy a part of it?
Well, that's the main concept. The main concept is that the psychopaths do not have empathy, and they are selfish and self-driven, And also a part of it is implied is that they do not have a long-term goal, and they'll maybe they do have a long-term goal, but they'll basically do things that will hurt themselves. Now, the literature from these wishy-washy people defines it as being, and I know he mentioned the antisocial personality disorder. I'll get into that in a second. But let's talk about psychopaths originally, because, by the way, the diagnostics manual for psychiatrists, the DSM, does not have a word called psychopath. It's not there. There's no illness agreed upon by psychologists called psychopath. And the researchers who research psychopaths generally tend to be some of the worst researchers in this field. The lowest of the bad schools, bad undergrads, not top performers. Let's say not the cream of the crop are researching this. And there are many reasons why. But the point is, they also define in this literature something called a criminal psychopath, which is a guy who ends up in jail. And then there's a successful psychopath, who's someone who's like a CEO or something like that. And these people estimate that about 1% of the population are psychopaths, about 4% of the corporate managers are psychopaths, and about 20% of people in prison are psychopaths.
I will see more like psychopath more be something regarding empathy, and like the higher position you get, the more empathic you are, so you're able to make more difficult decisions.
That's very interesting. So our dog is shouting, but this is very interesting. It seems to be the opposite. Look, they have basically a survey method, and it seems to be that there are more of those people in higher positions. Now, you do need to have some kind of empathy to have charisma. To have charisma, you must be able to empathize in some way. But what they're talking about, less than empathy really, because Ted Bundy had a lot of empathy. He won't be able to get close to people otherwise, the serial killer. But the only way that what they mean by empathy really is caring, not understanding.
I see.
You can understand someone's perspective, but not care about them at all. And this has to do with a lot of genes, actually. Let's mention this. So let me mention the studies that these psychologists are trying to justify their term psychopath. So they have done studies that show that gene expression in the brain, supposedly, with the people that fulfill this criteria from their checklist, they have a particular pattern. They have an overexpression of ribosomal protein, they have an overexpression of zinc finger protein, which are genes, and they have an overexpression of, interestingly, the opioid receptor delta gene, delta. So now, why? It's not very clear conceptually, and this is only expression. So this is a condition, a state in the brain. In terms of actual genes, in terms of genome-wide association studies, like is a certain polymorphism at a certain gene correlated to a result on this survey? Nothing. Not one gene has ever had genome-wide significance for psychopathy. Nothing. Zero. Not oxytocin, not serotonin transporter, not any kind of serotonin genes, nothing.
So that's what the genes, but how about the receptors and the hormones in the brain?
Well, they can't study the expression of the receptors directly. They can study how the genes look there and the transmission of and the expression of genes in the brain, which, as I said, the only thing they could find with the expression of the genes were those three genes. Not serotonin, not dopamine, not oxytocin, not anything you would think would be relevant. Now, they do find that they have also tried, by the way, antisocial personality disorder. Again, no single nucleotide polymorphism in the entire human genome reaches genome-wide significance for antisocial personality disorder. Antisocial personality disorder is defined in the diagnostic manual, and so it is a thing. It's called a spectrum thing, like autistic spectrum, and it has its own definitions. But again, no gene individually it has significance correlated to that. Now, I'm sure you could find correlations in terms of upbringing and stuff like that, but I'm going to speculate in a little bit on what I think is going on behind this. And I'm going to tell you my opinion of whether psychopaths really exist and how they exist. And I do have opinions on this, because one of my hobbies, this thing that I read about, that I talk about here, biology and longevity and brain stuff, is only one of the things that I'm interested in. One of my I have a lot of hobbies that I read about. One of them is criminal psychology, which I've been reading about since I was at least 10 years old. So I have certain opinions on that. But the point is, what I'm trying to get to is there is no... there is a study where they show that supposed the psychopaths, people that pass that checklist, let's not even call them psychopaths, but those people that pass that checklist tend to have lower gray matter volume in certain areas of the brain, including areas that are affected by the default mode network. But this is only apparent in the successful psychopaths, the corporate ones. The prison ones don't show a difference. So which doesn't make sense. Again, then if the prison ones have a different brain structure than the successful ones, and they're both psychopaths, then what's defining the prison psychopath in terms of his brain when you do the fMRI scans? So long story short, basically what I'm trying to say is these guys have been trying to prove that there's a thing called a psychopath. They publicized it so much from the 1920s to the 30s to the 40s until now. There are women all across the U.S. calling their boyfriends sociopath, psychopath. You're born a psychopath, and all their efforts with genes and with fMRI scans, they can't prove anything except gene expression for 3 genes that don't even make sense.
By the way, men also call their girlfriend psychopath.
Do they really?
Yeah.
Well, there are probably psychopathic women out there. No, I'm joking. What I mean to say is that this term is really abused in the society.
No, definitely. That's how I find the checklist.
Yeah.
It was going all over social media. Like,
with women, like it's your boyfriend, exactly. They'll try to do that, and so I'll just tell my opinion on this, okay? My opinion is this: I've known people in my life. This is now from personal experience, not from what I'm reading or anything. I've known people in my life that had no conscience that you could tell. They could harm people physically, violently, never think twice about it, not have nightmares at night. And then these people suddenly had a religious experience and they became religious and their whole personality changed. Okay, they have consciences, they care about people, they regret what they did genuinely, not just because of God. They regret things. And so that on its own tells me there's nothing really called a psychopath. Maybe it's a state of being instead of saying you are a psychopath. No, you are acting psychopathically. You are. That would make sense. That's one thing. And also this is from my personal life. But even if you look at the literature on what they call criminology, which is also sort of BS field, but that field, you'll find that it is common in gangs and even organized crime. For example, the Mexican mafia, which is one of the most violent mafias in the world. I mean, it's not a mafia, but it's a prison gang. There's a guy called, I think his name is Kilroy. He became religious. There's a few guys. There's like 5 or 6 of them became religious, totally changed their lives. This happens a lot in California because among the Mexican community, there's a strong Catholic culture. And people experience this thing where they completely change. These people murdered many people by hand. And they completely changed. Their life changed. And they really regret it afterwards. Yeah? And then I met people also in the corporate world. I was in a not a very high position, but I was in a very desirable position in one of the best companies in the world. And I knew a lot of high-powered people. I mean, really high-powered people. And a lot of these people didn't care about anybody. I mean, they're what you would call, psychopathic as well. But no, they wouldn't be recognized for it. You wouldn't know. You'd think they're just very successful at work. They would look at people like a piece of a puzzle and try to solve this puzzle through getting to their goals at work. And these people would smile in your face and stab you behind your back, and they don't care at all. So my point is this idea of a psychopath, and he's going a serial killer, and it's a kind of thing, and maybe your boyfriend is a psychopath. So this is all kind of ridiculous, and it's made by these psychologists. But if I would speculate, what I would think is this condition in the brain, although obviously, as I said, none of the scientific research shows it. What I would think is there's a gene called the oxytocin gene, oxytocin receptor gene, and I actually have this trait. I have an oxytocin receptor gene that expresses less oxytocin, so I have less empathy for other people, and this is in my family. I can see this in the background. There are people like that, and I've been told this before, that sometimes I'm less empathetic, but the way I'm empathetic is different. I still care about people, but sometimes certain situations I won't feel like if someone cries, I won't naturally feel like immediate empathy just from the crying. But if I know how you know what I mean, it just changes the way my dog got excited again, sorry guys, but it just changes the way I empathize with them, but not reduces my actual empathy. And by the way, all my genetic clients, genetic analysis clients, the cognitive section or the full sections that I used to do, you guys know your oxytocin receptor genes, and some of you that I've done have the full empathy like Lucie does. And some people have lower empathy like I do from that gene, and that thing is correlated to less empathy. But there are other genes, like for example, there is a gene that actually, I think it's in the serotonin complex, but there's a single nucleotide polymorphism that's correlated, or it may be in one of the degradation enzymes for one of the neurotransmitters. I can't remember where it was. It's correlated to being less less empathetic toward the out group. So your tribe, if we're in a tribal society, you would be empathetic toward your tribe, but you're antagonistic toward the out group. So if you're a Republican, you may just hate Democrats, or you may hate the Chinese if you're an American, because China is eventually going to overcome America, and we're all going to be speaking Chinese soon. But the point is, the out group, you may have less empathy toward them. So there are individual single nucleotide polymorphisms that are correlated to having less compassion for others or less empathy to others. And then, if you're talking about in terms of neurotransmitters, serotonin, the less serotonergic activity you have, the more violent you will be, and the more impulsive you will be. This is proven with academic research. So that's one thing. Also, as I said, oxytocin, the less oxytocin you have, the less compassionate you'll be with other people. But I was talking about the gene earlier. I'm talking about the transmission in general now. Also, less functionality of your default mode network, which is the stream of consciousness. So when you're sitting waiting at the bus stop and you're thinking about what you have to do and all that kind of stuff, less of that mode, because there are three main mode networks of the brain. One is called the default mode network, one is the executive control network, and one is the salience network. The salience network switches between the executive control and the default mode network. The executive control network is what's working when you're working on a math problem, or when you're sitting trying to do work or make a strategy for your company. If you're having more of the executive control network and less of the default mode network, by definition, you're going to be less remorseful and have less rumination, thinking over things over and over again. So probably you're going to be less empathetic and or less have less of a conscious, because you're going to be thinking about things less. So that logically that's the case. I don't know how norepinephrine or dopamine may affect things. I mean, if you have more norepinephrine activity or more glutamate activity, you're going to be more excitable. You're going to be more anxious. If you have more GABAergic activity, you're going to be less excitable and less anxious. But also, if you have for example, if your amygdala is disconnected from other parts of your brain, or your amygdala is underactive, like if you guys have watched the documentary Free Solo, which is about this climber, great climber, he has clearly, you just watch him talking, he has low amygdala activity. Very little excites him, which seems to be why he doesn't get as scared when he goes up to the top of the mountains. You could think that a supposed psychopath, if he was like him, would have less of an issue going into very dangerous terrain, killing someone, stuff like that. But you would also think that someone who has an overactive amygdala can become scared quickly, because the amygdala is the fight or flight response of the brain.
And have some impulsive response.
Exactly. He might just get upset, scared, anxious, and kill someone. But the other guy may be very calm and decide, I want to go kill someone. So it could go either way, What other neurotransmitters could we talk about? I mean, those are the ones that really affect it, that I could think could affect it. But as I said, this psychopath thing is not a real thing. It's a definition that you're creating for yourself. You're saying, here's a checklist. If you fulfill this, you're a psychopath. And now I'm going to try to study your brain. Oops, I can't find anything in common between all of you. So I don't know.
We should make a checklist for geniuses or like other categories like that.
Yeah, really what it should be is, it should be based on the way your brain actually physically works. We should have, and that makes sense. There are types of brain activities. There are structures of brains. There are people that have, as I said, underactive amygdalas, or people that have...
It's harder to measure than having the checklist.
Exactly. Yeah, it will be, one day we'll be able to measure these things better. Exactly. That's what it is. And the checklist is, not just the checklist, but the word is catchy. It's cool to say psychopath. It's cool to have this thing you have to worry about. This I have this book called The Psychopath Next Door, or you always worry, what if my neighbor's a psychopath? What if my boyfriend's secretly a psychopath, but I've never noticed because he's very normal. But maybe he's not normal. Maybe he really is a psychopath. I have to do the checklist. Oops, I did the checklist. He's actually a psychopath. What should I do? It's very fun for people, but this is ridiculous. So the psychology can sometimes be ridiculous. All right, that's all I have to say. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you next time.